The bathtub water had gone cold by the time they found her. It was February 11th, 2012, and the late afternoon light was beginning to soften over Beverly Hills. Inside Suite 434 of the Beverly Hilton Hotel, Whitney Houston lay submerged, her face down, her legs extended, her body still. A personal assistant had discovered her shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Pacific time. Hotel security was notified within minutes. Paramedics arrived and attempted resuscitation for approximately 20 minutes before she was pronounced dead at 3:55. She was 48 years old. The Grammy Awards were scheduled to take place that same evening, just floors below the suite where her body remained. By nightfall, the music industry would gather in formal attire to celebrate its own, even as news of her death rippled outward through every corner of the world. The woman once called the greatest voice of her generation had died alone, in silence, in a room paid for by her record label in advance of a pre-Grammy party she had been expected to attend. The official account came swiftly. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning. Contributing factors included atherosclerotic heart disease and acute cocaine intoxication. No foul play was suspected. No criminal investigation followed. The case was closed within weeks. Yet the finality of that conclusion did little to quiet the questions that followed. In the hours before her death, Whitney Houston had been seen in the hotel lobby, appearing disoriented. Witnesses described erratic behavior, unsteady movements, a woman seemingly disconnected from her surroundings. She had been photographed just 2 nights earlier at a club, her appearance gaunt, her eyes hollow. Friends who had seen her in recent months spoke of a woman caught between the pressures of a planned comeback and the weight of a body and spirit that had long been exhausted. The bathtub itself became an object of scrutiny. How long had she been submerged before discovery? Why had no one checked on her sooner? The timeline offered by investigators suggested she had been in the water for nearly an hour before being found. Her assistant had left her alone in the suite. A bodyguard remained outside, unaware. The door had been unlocked. And then there was the matter of the cocaine found in her system. Not residue from days before, but evidence of recent use, ingested within the final hours of her life. The substance had been part of her story for decades, a shadow presence that had derailed her career, fractured her marriage, and contributed to the slow erosion of her public image. But in those final days, she had been preparing for a return, a new album, a new film. The industry had welcomed her back with open arms, eager to forgive, eager to forget. The question of whether she had ever truly escaped the grip of her addiction was answered in a coroner's report that few wished to read aloud. But the full weight of what had happened in that hotel room cannot be understood without returning to where her unraveling had begun in earnest, 3,000 miles east, in a place far removed from the gilded corridors of Beverly Hills. There, on a quiet road in Mendham Township, New Jersey, stood the estate that had once symbolized everything Whitney Houston had achieved. A 12,000-square-foot Georgian colonial set on 5 acres of rolling terrain, surrounded by stone walls and iron gates, hidden from public view by dense clusters of oak and maple. She had purchased it in 1987, at the height of her commercial dominance, when her voice could fill stadiums and her name alone could sell out arenas. The property was meant to be a sanctuary, a retreat from the demands of fame, a place where she could raise a family and live beyond the gaze of tabloids and television cameras. For a time, it served that purpose. But over the years, the estate became something else entirely, a stage for dysfunction, a fortress of secrecy, a monument to the slow collapse of a life once thought untouchable. What happened inside those walls between the late 1980s and the early 2000s would only emerge in fragments, police reports, court filings, interviews given years after the fact, domestic disturbances, substance abuse, financial mismanagement, a marriage that began with promise and ended in public ruin. The Mendham estate was more than a home. It was a mirror. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born in Newark, New Jersey, in August of 1963, into a family where music was not a pastime, but a lineage. Her mother, Cissy Houston, had sung backup for Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, and Dionne Warwick. Her cousin was Dionne herself. Her godmother was Aretha. The expectations placed upon her voice were present from childhood, and by the time she entered adolescence, it was clear that she possessed something exceptional: a range, a control, a purity of tone that seemed to arrive fully formed, as though she had inherited not just talent, but mastery. She signed with Arista Records in 1983, at the age of 19, under the guidance of Clive Davis, the label executive who would shape much of her career. Her self-titled debut album arrived 2 years later and became the best-selling debut by a female artist in history. The singles that followed, Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, Greatest Love of All, dominated radio and television with a precision that felt almost mechanical. By the end of 1986, Whitney Houston had become a commercial force, unlike anything the industry had seen. She was elegant, composed, untouchable. Her image was carefully curated, her public persona polished to a high shine. It was during this period, at the peak of her early ascent, that she purchased the Mendham estate. The property had previously belonged to a businessman, and its provenance carried none of the historical weight of older American estates. But for Whitney Houston, its appeal lay elsewhere. The house was grand, but not ostentatious, set back from the road and surrounded by enough acreage to ensure privacy. The town of Mendham itself was small, affluent, overwhelmingly white. Her arrival was noted quietly. She was not the kind of celebrity who sought attention in her personal life. She wanted silence. She wanted stillness. She wanted a place where she could simply be. The estate offered that, at least in the beginning. Friends who visited in those early years described a home that was warm, welcoming, filled with family. Her mother was a frequent presence. Her brothers came and went. The staff was small but loyal. Whitney, they said, was relaxed there in a way she never seemed to be in public. She cooked, she gardened. She laughed loudly and often. The weight of performance lifted the moment she passed through the gates. But even then, there were signs of tension. Her schedule was relentless. Album cycles, world tours, television appearances, award shows. Each year brought new demands, new expectations, new pressures to exceed what had come before. The industry that had made her a star was not interested in rest. It wanted product. It wanted presence. And Whitney Houston, for all her talent, was not immune to the toll that such demands could take. In 1989, she met Bobby Brown. He was a former member of New Edition, a rhythm and blues group that had achieved considerable success in the early 80s before he launched a solo career, marked by a harder edge and a more provocative image. Where Whitney was refined, Bobby was raw. Where she projected control, he projected chaos. The pairing surprised nearly everyone in her orbit. Her mother disapproved openly. Her label executives worried about the effect on her carefully constructed brand. But Whitney was drawn to him in a way that defied calculation. He represented something she had never been permitted to express in public, an unguarded, unpolished self. They married in July of 1992, in a ceremony held on the grounds of the Mendham estate. The guest list was closely controlled. The press was kept at a distance. Photographs from that day show a bride in white, smiling beneath a floral arch, surrounded by family and friends. It was, by all appearances, a joyful occasion. But within months, reports began to surface of discord. Arguments overheard by staff, objects broken. Police called to the residence on more than one occasion. The estate that had once been a refuge was becoming something else, and the woman who lived within its walls was beginning to disappear. The marriage between Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown was from its earliest days a subject of intense public fascination. The contrast between them seemed almost theatrical, the pristine pop princess and the bad boy of New Jack Swing, united in a union that many predicted would not survive its first year. But survive it did, at least in name, for 14 years. What occurred within that span, particularly inside the Mendham estate, would only become fully visible in retrospect, through court documents, interviews, and the slow accumulation of incident reports filed with local police. Their daughter, Bobby Christina, was born in March of 1993, less than a year after the wedding. The birth was celebrated publicly, and Whitney spoke often in interviews of her desire to be a mother, to create a family life that mirrored the one she had known as a child. But the reality inside the estate was already diverging from that ideal. Bobby Brown's own legal troubles were mounting: arrests for drunk driving, assault, probation violations. His presence at Mendham was inconsistent. When he was there, the household atmosphere shifted. Staff members who later spoke to journalists described shouting matches that echoed through the halls, doors slammed with enough force to crack frames, an undercurrent of volatility that made the home feel less like a sanctuary and more like a pressure vessel. Whitney herself was not a passive figure in these conflicts. She could be sharp, combative, fiercely protective of her space and her autonomy. But she was also increasingly dependent on substances that dulled the edges of her existence. Marijuana use had been part of her life for years, tolerated quietly by those around her. But by the mid-1990s, cocaine had entered the picture. The drug offered a different kind of escape: intense, immediate, and ultimately corrosive. Friends who visited the estate during this period noticed changes. Her weight fluctuated. Her moods swung unpredictably. She cancelled appearances at the last minute, citing illness or exhaustion. The voice that had once seemed indestructible began to show signs of strain. The public, for a time, remained unaware. Whitney Houston continued to release albums, to perform at major events, to project the image of a woman in control of her destiny. Her 1992 soundtrack for The Bodyguard became one of the best-selling albums in history, propelled by the single I Will Always Love You. She was nominated for awards. She appeared on magazine covers. The machinery of fame continued to turn, and from the outside, it appeared that nothing had changed. But inside Mendham, the cracks were widening. In December of 1999, Bobby Brown was arrested at the estate following an altercation with Whitney. Police were called after reports of a domestic disturbance. Brown was charged with battery, though the charges were later reduced, and he avoided jail time. The incident made headlines, but Whitney declined to cooperate with prosecutors. She stood by her husband publicly, dismissing the episode as a private matter blown out of proportion by the media. The message was clear: whatever happened inside those walls was not for public consumption, yet the walls could not contain everything. In 2000, customs agents at a Hawaiian airport discovered marijuana in Whitney's luggage. She left the state before charges could be filed, and the case was eventually dismissed. The incident was minor in isolation, but it signaled a growing carelessness, a loosening grip on the discretion that had long shielded her private life from scrutiny. The woman who had once controlled every aspect of her public image was losing the ability to manage even the simplest logistics of travel. The estate itself began to reflect the disorder within. Maintenance was deferred. Staff turnover increased. Visitors described rooms that had fallen into disrepair, grounds that were no longer meticulously kept. The Georgian colonial that had once symbolized arrival and achievement was becoming a monument to entropy. And at its center, Whitney Houston remained, increasingly isolated, Increasingly dependent, increasingly unable to find her way back to the woman she had once been. The interview aired in December of 2002. Whitney Houston sat across from Diane Sawyer in a setting designed to convey intimacy. Soft lighting, neutral tones, the carefully arranged informality of a living room. It was her first major television appearance in years, intended to promote a new album and rehabilitate an image that had grown increasingly tarnished. But the conversation did not proceed as planned. When Sawyer asked about drug use, Whitney's response was immediate, defiant, and memorably evasive. She denied using crack cocaine, drawing a distinction between that substance and others she did not explicitly name. The moment became defining, replayed endlessly in the years that followed. A glimpse behind the curtain that confirmed what many had suspected, but none had been able to prove. The album she was promoting, Just Whitney, was released the same month. It debuted at number 9 on the Billboard charts, respectable by most standards, but a significant decline for an artist who had once dominated the top positions with ease. Critics noted the strain in her voice, the loss of the effortless power that had once defined her performances. She embarked on a limited tour, but dates were cancelled, rescheduled, and cancelled again. The machinery of her career was sputtering, and the industry that had once celebrated her began to recalibrate its expectations. Inside Mendham, the situation continued to deteriorate. Financial pressures, long masked by the scale of her earlier success, were becoming impossible to ignore. The estate required constant upkeep. Property taxes, staff salaries, maintenance costs that accumulated regardless of whether albums sold or tours proceeded. Whitney had earned tens of millions of dollars over the course of her career, but much of that wealth had been spent, mismanaged, or siphoned away by the various entourages and hangers-on who had attached themselves to her orbit. By the early 2000s, she was borrowing against future earnings to maintain a lifestyle that no longer matched her income. Her relationship with Bobby Brown remained volatile. The couple separated and reconciled multiple times, each cycle accompanied by public statements that alternated between devotion and recrimination. In 2003, Brown was arrested again, this time on charges related to a probation violation from an earlier offense. He served time in a county jail while Whitney remained at Mendham, alone with their daughter and the staff who continued to manage the household. Friends who visited during this period described a woman who seemed hollowed out, going through the motions of daily life without the spark that had once animated her presence. The tabloids, meanwhile, had turned her into a spectacle. Paparazzi photographs captured her looking gaunt, disheveled, unrecognizable from the polished figure who had once graced the covers of Vogue and Cosmopolitan. Television programs dedicated segments to her decline, inviting commentators to speculate on the causes and predict the outcome. The public narrative had shifted from admiration to morbid curiosity. Whitney Houston was no longer a star to be celebrated. She was a cautionary tale in progress. In 2004, she entered a rehabilitation facility for the first time, reportedly at the urging of her father and Clive Davis. The stay was brief, and its effectiveness was unclear. She returned to Mendham, where little had changed. The same patterns reasserted themselves: the isolation, the substance use, the cycles of conflict with Bobby. The estate that had once represented escape now felt more like confinement, a gilded cage from which she could not or would not leave. Her father, John Russell Houston, had long served as her manager, overseeing the business affairs that had made her wealth possible. But by this point, their relationship had grown strained. Disputes over money, over contracts, over the direction of her career had created a rift that would never fully heal. When he died in 2003, Whitney was reported to be devastated. The man who had guided her rise was gone, and with him, whatever stability his presence had provided. The walls of Mendham had witnessed all of it: the arguments, the reconciliations, the slow erosion of a family that had never quite cohered. And now those walls were closing in. The divorce was finalized in April of 2007. After 14 years of marriage, Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown formally ended their union in an Orange County, California courtroom. Whitney was granted custody of Bobby Christina, who was then 14 years old. The proceedings were largely uncontested. The terms settled quietly between attorneys. There were no prolonged battles over assets, no dramatic courtroom confrontations. Whatever remained to be divided had already been diminished by years of financial strain and mutual exhaustion. Whitney had, by that point, largely retreated from public life. Her last studio album had been released 5 years earlier, and no new material was forthcoming. She made occasional appearances, an award show here, a tribute performance there, but these were infrequent and often underwhelming. The voice that had once silenced rooms now wavered, cracked, struggled to reach notes that had previously come effortlessly. Industry insiders whispered that her instrument had been permanently damaged, whether by drug use, by overwork, or by the simple passage of time. The woman who had once defined vocal excellence was now a reminder of its fragility. The Mendham estate, too, had reached the end of its chapter in her life. The property that had symbolized her arrival among America's elite had become a financial burden she could no longer sustain. Property taxes alone exceeded $100,000 annually. Maintenance costs continued to accumulate. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, and even basic upkeep had been deferred indefinitely. In 2009, Whitney placed the estate on the market. The asking price was $9 million, a fraction of what she had invested in the property over 2 decades, but reflective of a real estate market that had collapsed in the wake of the financial crisis. The sale was protracted. Potential buyers toured the grounds and departed without making offers. The house showed signs of neglect that no staging could conceal: worn carpets, faded paint, landscaping that had grown wild in the absence of regular attention. For months, the estate sat empty, its iron gates closed, its windows dark. Whitney had already relocated to California, where she was attempting to rebuild some version of a career and a life. New Jersey, and everything it represented, was behind her. Eventually, in 2012, the property sold for an undisclosed sum, reportedly well below the asking price. The new owners were private individuals with no connection to the entertainment industry. They undertook extensive renovations, stripping away much of what had defined the home during Whitney's tenure. The recording studio she had built was dismantled. The interior was redesigned to suit different tastes. Within a few years, little remained to indicate that one of the most famous voices in American music had once lived within those walls. But before the sale was finalized, before the estate passed into other hands, Whitney Houston had already begun what would be her final act. In 2009, she released I Look to You, her first studio album in 7 years. The record debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, a commercial success that suggested the public had not entirely forgotten her. Critics were divided. Some praised her for perseverance, while others noted the limitations of her diminished vocal range. But the album sold well enough to justify a world tour. The tour, however, proved disastrous. Performances were marred by technical difficulties, by Whitney's evident physical struggles, by moments where she simply could not deliver what audiences expected. Reviews were scathing. Footage circulated online of concerts where she appeared winded, disoriented, unable to complete songs she had once sung with effortless command. The comeback that had been heralded as a triumph was quickly reframed as a miscalculation, a premature return that exposed how far she had fallen. She cancelled dates, She issued apologies. She retreated once more into privacy, this time in a rented home in Beverly Hills. The Mendham estate was gone. The marriage was over. The career that had defined her existence was flickering toward extinction. All that remained was a woman trying to find her footing on ground that had long since shifted beneath her. The years between the failed tour and her death were marked by a kind of suspended animation. Whitney Houston remained in the public eye, but only intermittently, appearing at events that seemed designed more to reassure the industry of her continued existence than to advance any coherent artistic vision. She attended award shows, presented honors to other artists, gave interviews in which she spoke optimistically about future projects. A second film role was announced, a remake of the 1976 musical Sparkle, in which she would play a supporting part. Recording sessions were scheduled, then postponed, then rescheduled again. The machinery of a comeback continued to turn, but slowly, haltingly, without the momentum that had once propelled her to the top of the charts. Her daughter, Bobbi Kristina, had by this point entered young adulthood, and the relationship between mother and child had grown increasingly complex. They were close in ways that those outside the family could not fully understand, bound by shared trauma, by the experience of living under constant public scrutiny, by the absence of the stable household that Whitney had once hoped to create. But there were also tensions. Bobbi Kristina had begun a relationship with Nick Gordon, a young man who had been informally raised in the Houston household since childhood. Whitney reportedly disapproved of the pairing, viewing it as inappropriate given their quasi-sibling history. The disagreement created friction that persisted through the final months of her life. Financially, Whitney remained in precarious territory. The sale of the Mendham estate had provided temporary relief, but the proceeds had been quickly absorbed by accumulated debts, legal fees, and the ongoing costs of maintaining even a reduced lifestyle. She no longer commanded the fees she once had for performances and appearances. Recording advances, once measured in the tens of millions, had shrunk considerably. The industry still valued her name, but that value was increasingly retrospective, tied to what she had been rather than what she might yet become. Her physical condition, too, had continued to decline. Friends who saw her in 2011 described a woman who appeared fragile, worn down by years of struggle. Her weight fluctuated dramatically. Her skin showed signs of damage. The voice, when she attempted to sing, was a shadow of its former self, still capable of moments of beauty, but no longer reliable, no longer the instrument that had once seemed capable of anything. She was 50 years old in appearance, though she had not yet reached her 50th birthday. In the weeks leading up to February 2012, Whitney traveled to Los Angeles to participate in the events surrounding the Grammy Awards. Clive Davis, the executive who had signed her nearly 3 decades earlier, was hosting his annual pre-Grammy gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Whitney was expected to attend, to perform, to remind the industry of what she had once represented. A suite had been reserved for her on the 4th floor. Her entourage, a personal assistant, a bodyguard, various associates, accompanied her to California. The days before the gala were filled with rehearsals, meetings, and social obligations. Whitney was seen at several events, including a party at a Hollywood club just 2 nights before her death. Photographs from that evening show a woman who appeared unwell, her hair damp, her expression distant, her posture unsteady. Witnesses later described behavior that suggested intoxication, though the precise substances involved remained unclear. She left the club in the early hours of the morning, returning to the Beverly Hilton. On the final day, Saturday, February 11th, Whitney spent the morning and early afternoon in her suite. She spoke with members of her team. She ordered room service. She prepared for the evening's event, which was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock. At some point in the early afternoon, she drew a bath. Her assistant left the suite to run an errand. Her bodyguard remained in an adjacent room. The door to the bathroom was closed, and for a period of time that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny, no one checked on her. When the assistant returned and entered the bathroom, she found Whitney submerged in the tub. The water had gone cold. There was no response to attempts at revival. Emergency services were called. Paramedics worked for 20 minutes before pronouncing her dead. The gala proceeded that evening, transformed into an impromptu memorial. Clive Davis addressed the crowd, his voice breaking as he spoke of the woman he had discovered and nurtured. Artists who had been scheduled to perform offered tributes instead. The Grammy Awards took place the following night, suffused with grief and remembrance. Whitney Houston, who had won 6 of those awards over the course of her career, was gone. The coroner's report was released 6 weeks after her death. Accidental drowning, with atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The toxicology findings confirmed what many had long suspected, but few had been willing to state plainly while she lived. The substance that had shadowed her for decades had been present in her system during the final hours, its effects compounding the vulnerability of a heart already weakened by years of strain. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication of struggle, no suggestion that anyone else had been present in the bathroom when she lost consciousness. The official conclusion was straightforward, even if the circumstances that led to that moment were anything but. The funeral was held in Newark, New Jersey, in the church where she had first sung as a child. The New Hope Baptist Church had been her mother's spiritual home, the place where Whitney's voice had first been recognized as something extraordinary. Now it received her body, surrounded by family, friends, and fellow artists who had come to pay their respects. The service was private, though portions were broadcast to a global audience. Speakers remembered her talent, her generosity, her capacity for joy. The casket was closed. The burial followed at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, where she was interred beside her father. In the years that followed, the questions surrounding her death gradually receded from public attention, replaced by the more enduring work of legacy construction. Documentaries were produced, biographies published, tribute concerts organized. Her catalogue continued to generate revenue, her songs still played at weddings and funerals, and moments of private significance. The voice endured, even as the woman who had possessed it faded into memory. The Mendham estate passed through subsequent owners, its connection to Whitney Houston becoming a footnote in real estate listings rather than a defining feature. The town itself remained as it had always been, quiet, affluent, indifferent to the fame that had once resided within its borders. The stone walls and iron gates that had promised sanctuary stood unchanged, guarding a property that no longer bore any trace of the life once lived within. Bobby Christina Brown died 3 years after her mother, in July of 2015. She was found unresponsive in a bathtub in her Georgia home, the parallels to her mother's death immediate and unavoidable. She lingered in a coma for 6 months before succumbing. She was 22 years old. The cycle that had begun in Newark, that had wound through the rooms of Mendham, that had ended in a Beverly Hills hotel suite, claimed one final figure before falling silent. What remains is the music. The recordings made during the years when everything still seemed possible. The voice captured in studios and concert halls, preserved in formats that will outlast those who remember the woman behind them. It plays still, in grocery stores and airport lounges, and the headphones of strangers who never